Hello, I'm Charlotte Grund. I'm a PhD student at the University of St. Andrews, working in the Wild Minds Lab. And today I'm going to present to you the coding methods of the Gestural Origins project. It's funded by the ERC and led by Kat Hobeiter. And it aims to compare great ape gesture use across species. So we have data on gorilla species, on the pan species, human children, and hopefully at some point as well, orang-utans. And although we have all our own research projects and aspects of gesture use we're interested in, we aim to compare all those species in the end and kind of establish one big database. So we all use the exact same data collection protocol and coding scheme, and we're interested in the end to see, for example, in what ways their gesture types overlap. So do they use the same gesture types? Do they have similar repertoires? What about meaning assignments? Do gestures mean the same? Are there maybe more subtle differences between, for example, chimpanzee communities and the way they use certain gestures? And we're also interested in socio-ecological factors and how they might influence or be responsible for the gestural patterns we find. So we study those apes in their natural habitats. And this is the research group, and a lot of them are also today in the workshop. Generally, we define gestures broadly as signals produced by the body, so movements of body parts or the body as a whole that are mechanically ineffective and used in intentional goal-directed communication. So with the gesture, the signaler aims to elicit a certain particular response in the recipient, a behavioral change, by using the gesture, so by communicative means and not by force. This is an example of a gesture, so a gestural interaction. Thursday is approaching Mugisha, the silverback. She first looks at them, then turns around, looks again, then goes into a present, response waits, and then Mugisha starts grooming her. And as this made her cease her gesturing, this is interpreted as the goal of the communication. So the apparently satisfactory outcome for Thursday, the female here, was to be groomed by the silverback. As I said, we're interested in the natural gestural behavior of great apes, so we study them in their natural wild environments. And we collect video data on any sort of social interaction with potential gesture use we find, so ad libitum. And then we analyze this video data with the video annotation software Elan. So that's where we implemented our coding scheme. And I'm going to present to you now one example of a communication present the coding scheme while doing it. So this is an interaction of mother and son. It's actually an exchange, so both are gesturing, first the son and then the mother, and this is the part of the mother. So here, Mubwindi, the mother, is the signaler. So Mubwindi is passing, Kagote does a grab hold, Mubwindi looks back, and then there's a push, and Kagote climbs on. I'm going to play this again in slow motion just to be sure that you can see everything. So Mubwindi, the mother, goes grab hold from Kagote, the first gesture, then Mubwindi looks back, pushes, response waits, keeps looking, and then when Kagote climbs, they start traveling together. So we code exchange separately. This is the same communication, but it gets a B because it's the second part of the communication. Here the signaler is the mother, the recipient is the son, we annotate in which behavioral context they were before any gesturing happened. So they were both resting before. Then the directedness, in this case, it was very clear. The mother, the son was looking at the mother when he gestured. In this case, it's like, yeah, it's about the gesture of the mother. So I'm just going to talk about the mother's gesture. So she was clearly like looking at him before she gestured. And also it's even a contact gesture, so it has a clear recipient. Then we mark the goal. That is usually the outcome as well, like the context they're in after the communication, if the communication was successful. So in this case, it was climb on me from the perspective from the mother. But now I'm first going to talk about the gesture instance and how we code the gestures. So we have split them a little bit into action and body parts to have enough detail on different like constellations. So actually we have the action as kind of the basic gesture record, and then lots of modifiers that are coded per gesture record that are describing the gesture in more detail. So this is the big annotation, and these are all like kind of child tiers. And this annotation is the gesture from the very, very start to the very end. But then we also have the MAU, which is the minimal action unit, which aims to describe the gesture action part that sufficiently describes the gesture action. So in this case, from the start of the gesture to the first kind of push movement into the body of the recipient. So at this point, at the end of the MAU, the gesture action can actually be completely understood, because the following part of the gesture action, which is like the continuation of the push, doesn't really add any more information. So the minimal action unit is kind of the basic part of the gesture action that discriminates it against all other gesture actions. And this is also the start from where we measure response weighting. But I will talk about that a bit more later. Then we have a repetition count. So for any kind of gestures that have repetitions, for example, chest beats and the mountain gorillas, we annotate the sorry. We annotate the different hits. Then we mark which body part was used, whether the gesture was audible as well. The laterality, so was it the right or left hand? The contact, so whether the gesture made contact with and with what body part. The directionality. So in this case, the force that is applied by the mother on the back, the recipient does not go into this direction, so he actually turns around and goes into the opposite direction. So this push was apparently undirected, but for example, often they kind of push another individual to move away, and often this individual goes into the exact direction of the push force, and then in this case it would be, for example, location. Then we mark or annotate if there was an object involved in the gesture, for example, an object shakes or hitting on trees, for example. Then for more free gestures, as for example, arm raises or reaches, we have this kind of flexion orientation tiers. So we mark whether the palm was down or up. So these are kind of more subtle differences. We could imagine, for example, between different chimpanzee communities, maybe some more like reach like this and others more like that. And in order to be able to detect this kind of subtle differences, we also have these tiers. Then we mark facial expressions of like whether it was accompanied by facial expression. or by a vocalization, we mark the distance between the interacting individuals. So this tier is a little bit like, the idea is to see whether any kind of social factors might influence that. You can imagine maybe two individuals with a large rank difference between them might gesture from further away, or species with a very cohesive social structure might consistently gesture from closer distance or so. So in order to be able to have a crude idea of those influences. Then visual attention. So in this case, it was 90 degrees, visual attention 90 degrees. So it seems like kind of maybe the gesture was in the sphere of the recipient, but it's not clear that he actually saw the gesture. But as it's a contact gesture in this case, it's also not strictly necessary, probably. Then we have an effectiveness tier. So generally, of course, gestures are mechanically ineffective, but we wanted to have a little bit more, or investigate this a little bit further, because actually quite some gestures do manipulate the recipient in some form, in, for example, pulls or other types of kind of mechanical contact gestures. There is some manipulation of the recipient, and often it's also congruent with the outcome. But then there are other gestures, for example, presents, that that are like that don't really make a mechanical impact on the recipient, but still are kind of congruent with the outcome because they sort of facilitate the outcome. For example, in the video I showed you before with the present for grooming, that would be then the gesture did not make any physical contact with the recipient, but it was congruent with the outcome. In this case, the gesture was not really congruent with the outcome because the recipient actually went into a different direction than the force of the push. So he turned around and went on to climb on. Then we have the bout part tier with lots of child tiers, where we annotate things like more like environmental factors. Were they on the ground? What was the kind of, was it a thick vegetation ground or swampy ground or solid? Or were they in the tree or on another individual? We also have visibility. So between the two individuals, was the visibility clear, or was there lots of vegetation, for example? Yeah, you could imagine in case of like very thick vegetation that they would maybe use more contact gestures or audible gestures as visual, like because there's like visual impairment. So in order to have a crude idea of that. And then we have facial expressions, vocalizations, and gestural responses. So was there any kind of communicative signal following this gesture instance by the recipient? Then we have recipient reaction, so the behavioral change of the recipient. In this case, it was climb on. Response weighting was yes, persistence no. There was no other gesture following this one, and then goal met yes. And here we have timings, other timings. For example, when there would have been like a gestural response by the recipient, it would have been marked here to have the timing, or a vocal response, it would have been marked here. Then we have the behavioral change start here, which is the time the goal was met. So in this case, we measure it from when the recipient was fully on the mother. And this is also the end of response weighting. So we start measuring response weighting at the end of the MEU towards the start of the fulfillment of the goal. Then we have other latency. Oh shit, And then we have other latency tiers. It doesn't matter. Here, latency 1, latency 2. This is like from the start of the gesture, what was the kind of the first behavioral response by or reaction by the recipient. In this case, there wasn't really another reaction other than the goal, but he started to fulfill the goal already here. So we have this timing. And latency 2 is especially interesting for like sequences. So this is the tier where we mark what was kind of the reaction of the recipient, or the first reaction of the recipient after all information was available to him. So all the gestures in the sequence were already done. What was kind of the first behavioral response then? So this is kind of, as we have like lots of timings, we have a lot of flexibility later in analyzing the data, and especially like for things especially for things like response weighting, we can decide to take different measurements, for example, at the end of the MAU or at the end of the complete gesture action, as it's usually done. So it still allows for that. Yeah, so I'm going to show you still like how this looks like in the database later. Currently we use FileMaker, but we might change that too. So yeah, so this kind of gesture record that I just showed you now looks like this here. So this is one row in the data sheet and has all the variables, all the tiers that I just explained to you. And yeah, this is how it looks like. So each gesture instance gets its own row. And yeah, so that's our coding scheme. We actually plan to make it open access, so we plan to publish it together with like a very detailed data collection protocol, like explaining all the variables and the kind of theoretical reasoning behind them. And so if you have any feedback or so, we would be really happy. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the workshop.